Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughn Manor. And it's the Robert E. Howard Show. It's the Robert E. Howard Show once again. And Roger and I are here to talk about Conan in anticipation of Sumerian September, which is almost upon us. Sumerian September, where we will be reading every single Conan story written by Robert E. Howard. All the original Conan stories written by Robert E. Howard. And there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can get this fancy pants volume from Gallant's, edited by Stephen Jones, right? I am right? Yeah, Stephen Jones edited this volume. He gathered together all of the Conan stories, every single one, for this really nice hardcover edition, the Complete Chronicles of Conan. So this is a good one to have, but this is not the one I'll be reading. I'll actually be reading the 3-volume set from Del Rey Books, which is based on the set published originally by Wandering Star. This 3-volume set, in my opinion, is by far the best edition of Conan that you can get, and probably will remain so for some time. Fantastic, fully illustrated editions of the Conan stories. This is every scrap that Robert E. Howard wrote about Conan, with a lot of extra stuff, introductions and appendices and all that jazz. So these are great. And so this is what I'm going to be reading. And we live in a good time to be a Conan fan, because we have these really nice editions of the Conan saga as written by Robert E. Howard. Now, for a long time, if you were a Robert E. Howard fan, you couldn't get this. For most of my life as a Robert E. Howard fan, these did not exist. I had to wait a long time for an edition of Conan by Robert E. Howard that was complete and without a bunch of extra stuff in it, as I will explain right now. But it was a long time that I waited for these, because for years and years, the only way you can get the original Robert E. Howard Conan stories was in this series edited by L. Sprague de Camp. This was originally a 12-volume series of paperback books, originally from Lancer, and then they were published by Ace Books here in the States. I think it was Sphere in Great Britain who published these. And this set of books had a lot of extra stuff in it. It had stories written by L. Sprague de Camp and stories written by Lynn Carter. And there were Robert E. Howard stories that weren't Conan stories that were turned into Conan stories for this set of books. So there was a bunch of pastiche fiction mixed in with Robert E. Howard's fiction, which sucked. Now, I know that this set of books, which was very popular in part because of the great Frank Frazetta covers, this set of books was the introduction of a lot of people to the character of Conan. And this set of books did keep the character alive and in the public consciousness for a long time. However, I maintain and have maintained that it would have been better to have published, say, 6 volumes of Robert E. Howard, and just Robert E. Howard. And then if you wanted to have pastiche fiction about Conan, fine, go ahead and publish that. But, publish that after you publish the original Robert E. Howard stuff, and leave those stories as Robert E. Howard wrote them. But that's not what happened. And I was not the only one annoyed by this. There were a lot of people who were annoyed by the way Conan was published, and how this was the only way that Conan was published for decades. And eventually these went out of print, and there was nothing for years, which was really terrible. But like I said, I'm not the only one that was annoyed by this. One person that was annoyed by this was the great Karl Edward Wagner. The great Karl Edward Wagner, who was a wonderful writer of fantasy and horror. And he was a good editor, too. For a long time, he edited a series of the best horror stories. He did that for years. But he wrote a lot of great horror stories as well. And one of my favorite paperbacks from the Paperbacks from Hell era is this one, Why Not You and I, by Karl Edward Wagner, which has a bunch of his horror stories in it. And this is the volume where I first read Karl Edward Wagner's horror stories. But he is best known for writing the Kane series, the dark fantasy series featuring the character Kane, who featured in 3 novels, Bloodstone, Dark Crusade, and Darkness Weaves. Also was the star, Kane was, of many short stories written by Karl Edward Wagner. So Karl Edward Wagner is best known for Kane. But like I said, he was also an editor, and he was very interested in pulp fiction and stories from the pulps. And of course, he loved Robert E. Howard, the greatest pulp writer of all time. And he was really annoyed by the fact that you couldn't get a set of Conan books as Robert E. Howard wrote them. It just didn't exist. And so he decided, you know what? I'm going to try to make this exist. I'm going to come out with an authorized edition of Conan. And you're like, an authorized edition? Wasn't Robert E. Howard dead? Yeah, he was. He was dead. But what he meant by that is that it was authorized by Glenn Lord, who was the literary executor of Robert E. Howard. And so I'm assuming that's what he meant when he came out with the authorized edition. Unfortunately, this was not something that he was able to complete. But he did come out with 3 volumes. And this was the first volume, The Hour of the Dragon. This was a book that had been published before in the Lancer series, edited by L. Sprague de Camp. This was retitled Conan the Conqueror. And it did have some changes that were made for that edition. This, the first edition of the authorized Conan from Karl Edward Wagner, this presents The Hour of the Dragon exactly, well, more or less exactly as it was published in Weird Tales. And so this was a pretty big deal. And it was, like I said, it was Karl Edward Wagner's hope that he would be able to come out with a full set of the 21 Conan stories in a nice edition. I think he was hoping for 5 or 6 books. He ended up with 3. They originally were published in paperback, which I have around here somewhere, but I was looking for them and they weren't where they were supposed to be. Is there anything more frustrating in this world than looking for a book and you know where it is and then you go there and it's not there? I'm not sure there is anything that frustrating, but I have these hardcovers at hand, and the first one was The Hour of the Dragon, which was Robert E. Howard's only full-length Conan novel. Then he followed that up with People of the Black Circle, and the stories that were in this volume were The Devil in Iron, The People of the Black Circle, A Witch Shall Be Born, and Jewels of Gwalar. And so a bunch of cool old stories, and these editions do have original artwork from Weird Tales as well. So that's another cool thing about these volumes. What ended up being the final volume in this series was this one, Red Nails. Red Nails. And the stories that were included in this volume, Beyond the Black River, one of the best Conan stories ever, Shadows in Zamboula, Red Nails, and then The Hyborian Age, the essay about Conan's world, was the last thing in this volume, followed by an afterword. And again, some more Weird Tales artwork there. And that was it. That's as far as he got with this project, were these 3 books, which was really unfortunate. Now, why he did this, he says himself in the introduction to his first volume, The Hour of the Dragon. Let me go into that. So, in addition, this is from the introduction, in addition to the 21 Conan stories that Howard actually wrote, there has been a number of Conan pastiches written by various authors in an effort to fill gaps in the Cimmerian's career. While Howard did leave a few very brief fragments and outlines for other Conan stories, which have been completed through posthumous collaboration, later writers have revised non-fantasy adventures to turn them into Conan stories. That's L. Sprague de Camp. That's who he's talking about. And have further altered Howard's Conan through a vast body of frank pastiches. These are not Conan stories, not Robert E. Howard's Conan, and have no more validity in relation to the stories than any Conan tales you might yourself decide to write. I have written Howard pastiches myself, so I can speak both as a reader and an author. Every author leaves his personal mark on whatever he writes. The only man who could write a Robert E. Howard story was Robert E. Howard. Read Howard pastiches as you will, but don't let anyone kid you that you're reading Robert E. Howard. It is far more than a matter of imitating adjective usage or analyzing comma splices. It is a matter of spirit. To date, there had never been a definitive edition of the complete Conan tales. Gnome Press published the Conan stories in a series of hardcover editions in the early 1950s. However, their edition lacked the Veil of Lost Women. Howard's other stories were subjected to editorial emendations and revisions, and pastiches were included in the collection. In the 1960s, Lancer Books, Sphere Books in Britain, brought out the Conan stories in a series of paperbacks, but again, with editorial altering of Howard's original material, and Howard's own Conan tales were mixed in with posthumous collaborations, revisions, and outright pastiches. It is intended that this present edition will, for the first time, present all 21 of Robert E. Howard's Conan tales in their original form, with no editorial emendations, no collaborations, no revisions, no pastiches. Unfortunately, at a time when Conan is at a new peak of popularity, too many fans know Conan only through pastiches, or as the posturing superhero of the comics. Howard's authentic portrayal of the barbarian from Cimmeria may come as a shock to many. At this writing, contractual difficulties have delayed the inclusion of all 21 tales. It is hoped that these problems can be resolved soon, so that we may present Conan fans with the long-awaited, definitive Conan collection. Unfortunately, that was not to be. Whatever the difficulties were in publishing all of the stories, and I'm not sure what they were because I'm pretty sure they were all except for a few in the public domain. There were a few that were not, but certainly enough to come out with a fourth volume. So I'm not sure why this series ended at 3, but it did. So it was a false start, these 3 volumes. They were really cool, and they are still highly collectible, and I was very happy to have them because, like I said, I was almost as annoyed as Karl Edward Wagner about the state of Conan and Conan publishing back in the day. Not quite as annoyed as Karl Edward Wagner, though. I mean, I happen to think that the comic book Conan was pretty good, and that Roy Thomas did a really good job of adapting the character into comics. But I understand where Karl Edward Wagner was coming from, because for a lot of people, that's the only way they knew Conan. And for a lot of people, the average reader, for example, who was reading this series of books, you know, how easy would it be to know, okay, this is Robert E. Howard, this is L. Sprague de Camp, this is Lynn Carter. They were just reading it all as Conan and having a great time, I'm sure. But that was a problem, right? And so Karl Edward Wagner's dream of getting a complete set of Conan never happened in his lifetime. He passed away in 1994, unfortunately. And I believe the first complete set of Conan was published after that, I think. And that was the Fantasy Masterworks edition, which came out in 2 volumes, which became this. And both the Fantasy Masterworks and this have the same dedication, I believe. Let me get to it, if I could find it here. Got a nice picture of Conan here. Acknowledgements, here it goes. Okay, the dedication. In memory of Karl Edward Wagner, who began this project more than a quarter of a century ago, and L. Sprague de Camp for keeping the Hyborian age alive. So, Stephen Jones, wisely, was not picking any sides here, but he recognized that this project was important, that it was important to get a complete set of the Conan stories out there for people to read, which is what Karl Edward Wagner wanted. It is true, L. Sprague de Camp kept Conan alive for years and years, but this is the real thing, and this is what I was always hoping for, is a complete set of Robert E. Howard's Conan as he wrote the stories. So I'm glad that this exists, and I do appreciate the work that Karl Edward Wagner attempted. He tried to get that out there. He just did not succeed. And I guess that's all I have to say today. Here on the Robert E. Howard Show, I will catch you next time.